I decided last week that when I was going to teach this week's Torah portion, VaYeira, which contains the binding of Isaac, I was going to look for something positive, something uplifting. I remember walking with my mother on the way towards Rosh Hashanah services this last year, where I was conducting services, and some of what I was going to deliver was still a question mark to me. I said to her, "What should I try to do?" She said, "This is a moment where people really need more hope." And I remember saying to myself, good, I needed to hear that, and from my mother, and thank God. And Torah has that too, so let's do that. So when it came time for the binding of Isaac to come around in our weekly portion this week, I decided to look not away from it, but for something within the portion that was less scary. So last week we read of many things, including Abraham's circumcision, from which he's healing at the beginning of this week's Torah portion. And there's a famous section where God visits Abraham at the beginning of this week's portion, at the edge of Abraham's tent, which is open in all directions during the heat of the day to let the cooling air potentially come in, help him in his healing. He's there with God, and then all of a sudden he catches sight of three potential visitors, and despite the fact that he's healing, he's in such a vulnerable physical place, he runs to greet these three. And you say to yourself, as a sensitive reader of the text, he must be in so much pain, how could he do that? And the way that a lot of scholars have looked at this is that he places the needs of other human beings even before that of God. And that stands in stark contrast with the binding of Isaac, where his notion of what is right between people is clearly set aside in prioritizing his devotion to God. So prioritizing God over what you think is right to do with people is called by scholars such as Kierkegaard the teleological suspension of the ethical. I suspend what I know is right, and I go and do what God says, and that leads to very, very dangerous things in this world. Well, the opposite is the beginning of this Torah portion, which is when Abraham gets up from the presence of God and runs to take care of three visitors during the heat of the day. He does what Rabbi Shai Held, a living legend, calls the postponement of the theological in preference in prioritizing the ethical, which means theoretically what he's doing is setting God aside, saying, I'll come back to you, but there are people right in front of me. And those are two contrasts, but what Shai ends up doing in this week's portion brings me into a very, very important moment of my own life's reflection when it comes to Torah. He says it's actually not setting aside God to take care of the people. It is seeing that by taking care of people, in Hebrew, hachnasat orchim, welcoming guests, I'm actually seeing God in them, and therefore not postponing at all what it is to see God. The images of God are right in front of me. I wanted to only focus on the welcoming of the guests and not the binding of Isaac. But we can't do that, actually. I wanted to do that. But as I began discussing some of the things in this week's portion with students, including my own children, and when, as part of this week's lived experience, there was yet another school shooting in Santa Clarita at Saugus High School, it was impossible for me to see anything other than the entire picture, which is to say, if I don't bind myself to the children of this world, if we don't bind ourselves to the children of the world, and we don't protect them in this epidemic, not just of vulnerability, but of death, how can I understand anything in this Torah portion? I can't set God above people, because if I do so, I'm missing God in the people. And if I'm looking at the people, God's image, especially our children, if I'm bound, I'm bloodied. I can't suspend the ethical and still say that I'm living a life with God. And I can't say that I love God if I don't see the images of God vulnerable. And so I don't actually have a way of tying this in a bow. I don't have any way of ending this thought in a synthetic and only optimistic way, except to say this: we must commit to bind ourselves to our children, not sacrifice them, and not to see anything as more important than their safety and lives. Your children are my children, and we just lost 2 children in Santa Clarita. We have lost thousands, millions. And in the last year alone, almost maybe upwards of 40,000 lives in America lost because of a gun violence epidemic. We have work to do. And if we're going to claim that we love God, we better love our children better than we have. And if we claim to be faithful, we have to recognize that faith calls us into action on the streets, in the schools, in our theaters, in our mosques, in our synagogues, in our churches, in our public space, and by God, in the halls of legislation in America. We have no right to claim faith if we don't act in good faith with our children. May we be truly bound to them. May we learn from the mistakes of the past, and may we recognize that only by seeing God in the eyes of another human being and acting on that devotion can we truly claim to be living faithfully.